You'll release this section of the roof and engage and fire the passenger ejector seat. Whoosh.
Ejector seat? You're joking.
Ejector seat on, cuz!
Hello, my name is John, and I love to talk movies, especially action, comic book films, horror films, but I also love comic book media in general, whether it's TV shows or even comics, and I also love anime. If any of that stuff interests you, consider clicking that subscribe button. And today, we are continuing my James Bond journey, where I watched through all of the main Eon production James Bond films, most for the first time. And today we're moving on to the third film, and that is 1964's Goldfinger, directed by Guy Hamilton, starring Sean Connery. And I guess let's get started by talking about the action. The action is very creative in this film, especially when you're talking about the Aston Martin and all the gadgets it has, whether it's the ejector seat, the radar system, the guns that pop up, and the front. It's very creative action throughout this film. That being said, the actual action set pieces themselves I didn't find quite as engaging or as exciting as From Russia with Love or some other 60s action films. And I think part of that is the hand-to-hand. It felt passable. It didn't feel the greatest. It felt passable for its time, especially. And so I think the creativity helps push the action forward. And one action scene in particular is the Harold Sakata's character is fighting James Bond in Fort Knox towards the end. And I just think the hand-to-hand wise, it felt a little slow moving. It felt like they were sleepwalking towards each other, kind of. And it just felt slow for an action sequence, especially compared to the rest of the action sequences in this film or even previous films. But I do think a lot of the vehicular action, whether it's the creativity of the Aston Martin or even the very end with the plane crash, I think that was executed very well. Moving on to the acting, I think Sean Connery, at least within these first three films, this is probably his best performance and even the best written James Bond has been. But I think one of the standouts for me, even though they weren't necessarily a big part in the second half of the film, was the Masterson sisters. I mean, the first sister's only in like the first or second scene, I guess. But I think their story, how the first one died and then the second one is kind of after revenge against Goldfinger, and she ultimately dies as well. Both die within James Bond's presence as well. I think their story gives a lot more emotional weight to the movie than we've seen in the previous two James Bond movies. And so that's why I think they stand out, is because they add more emotional depth to the film. And I actually think they're better Bond girls than the Honor Blackman's character, which I'm not going to say her character's name. But her character, I think the Masterson sisters, particularly Tilly Masterson, is a better Bond girl than Honor Blackman's character. But on to Honor Blackman's character, I think the performance is pretty well done. And I think they give her a nice twist at the end, even though I did have a little issues with how they came to it, which I'll get into later when I talk about writing. But then the villains in this film are probably the best ones we've seen. Goldfinger, I don't necessarily think the performance was like this outstanding performance or anything, but I think his writing was better than Dr. No, which I think Dr. No had a better performance, but I think this writing was a little bit better for Goldfinger. But I think Harold Sakata was a great kind of cheesy type character to fit a film like this, because he's basically kind of like a superhuman. Moving on to the visuals, I think this film has a fantastic production design, whether it's Goldfinger's layer thing where when they're in Europe with the laser gun and James Bond strapped to like the metal or gold table. I think that all looks very well. It's designed extremely well, and it's shot well as well. And then the Goldfinger's farm and his kind of lair, how it has the opening on the floor and then the pool table, which turns into like a control center. I think all of that was designed very well, and then the camera work used it very well as well. I need to stop saying well. Anyway, Fort Knox looked really good as well, and I love the way they use the camera work to make it all look very good. And so the cinematography, as I'm basically saying, is very good. It looks great. And then like the plane at the end where I'm assuming they use like some kind of model thing, because I don't think they used CGI back then. But I think that was handled well. It looked very well. And I think it's aged better than some movies that are even 10 to 20 years newer than it. Moving on to the story and the writing, I think this is a major bright spot from this film, especially when you take into account that it was somewhat of a weaker spot in the previous two films, in my opinion. But I think one of the reasons for that, as I mentioned earlier, is the Masterson sisters and how their deaths, and Tilly looking for revenge and then dying, both died within James Bond's presence. I think it just adds some more emotional depth and some more emotional weight to the film. And I think, along with the writing, I think Goldfinger and his plan was in going through Fort Knox and stuff. I thought it was very well and cheesy at times, and I liked the plan, the strategic plan of it. And I like how they kind of switch up the reasoning, how you think he's doing it to steal the gold, but in reality he's doing it to kind of make the gold radioactive, so basically destroying the gold. So his gold supply, the price of it increases. And so I thought that was a nice touch, kind of changing his reasoning like that. And then I think kind of the twist where you think all of the guards are passed out, but then they wake up during the middle of the heist and you realize that the actual gas that Goldfinger planned to use wasn't actually being used. I thought that was a nice kind of twist within that sequence. And then I think one thing this film does great is it sets up things early on in the film that are set up for things later on, that I think makes the payoffs in like the end of the film much better. Especially one that stands out to me is kind of the electrocution, how that first scene, he's in like the middle of some other mission and he electrocutes the guy that's trying to kill him. But then at the end, with Harold Sakata's character, granted it's different kinds, but it electrocutes him as well. And there's other things like that that just kind of have good payoffs and setups early on in the film, and then payoffs later on that are very well done. And I think the pacing is very good throughout this film, with the exception of the Sakata Bond fight that I mentioned earlier, just because it felt like they were sleepwalking through the fight. And on top of that, it just felt like it lasted too long as well. I was kind of getting bored by the fight towards the end of it and just wanted it to end. But outside of that, that one sequence or scene, the film is paced very well. One, I guess, nitpick about the writing would be a particular scene that stuck out to me as just not aging well from a story standpoint, and that is James Bond and Honor Blackman's character when they're in the barn or farm right before they go on to Fort Knox and that whole thing happens. I just don't think it's aged particularly well, because Honor Blackman's character wants to basically leave the barn, but James Bond kind of grabs her and they get into a fight, and then it ends with James Bond on top of her, and then he goes in for a kiss, and that's just kind of how it ends. It just felt a little wrong within a modern society point of view, and so I just don't think it's aged very well, that scene in particular. Moving on to the sound, this is another bright spot. It's been a bright spot within all of these movies. But I think Shirley Bassey's song, Goldfinger song, is very catchy. It sticks in your head and it's very good. But I love the way they implement the Goldfinger song and the Goldfinger score and the themes all together throughout the film. And I just love, like, just little subtle things, like at the beginning when James Bond gets knocked out when he's opening the fridge, and then you see a shadow of a man, which was probably Sakata's character, and you just hear like this theme come on. Stuff like that works very well in this film. And then another thing with the sound is when you're in Fort Knox and they put the countdown on, there's kind of this pulsing sound throughout that just gives the whole sequence a little bit of a ticking clock type of sound, and it adds a sense of urgency to the situation as well. Now moving on to the rating. This is a film that has great writing, great production design, great sound and score, and some good performances. Maybe Sean Connery's best within the James Bond franchise. But I think one thing would be the action. I do think it's good, and I do think it's really good, but I don't think it's as good as it could have been, or maybe should have been. But it is very creative, which kind of makes up for some of the misfalls within the actual staged action. So I do think it is really good. So I'll probably give this a 4.25, 4.25. It's a very well made movie. Thanks for watching my review of 1964's Goldfinger. I love action movies, and this is a nice classic 60s action thriller. And so if you love movies, action, horror, comic book movies, comic book media, anime, if you love anything nerd related, just consider clicking that subscribe button. I might have reviews or rankings or whatever coming up. And just stay tuned for the rest of my James Bond journey, and have a great day.